For decades, China believed it had mastered the logic of global power. Invest patiently, avoid disruption, respect the rules, and trust that time, slow, predictable time, always favors the prepared. Then, in a single night, that belief collapsed. Hours after praising Xi Jinping as an older brother, Venezuela's president was seized in a US raid, blindfolded, handcuffed, and photographed aboard an American warship. One image wiped out years of Chinese diplomacy. One decision turned stability into shock. This was never just about Venezuela. It was about what happens when the world's most powerful country decides that surprise itself is a strategy and rules are optional. China condemned the move publicly. Privately, it did something far more revealing. It recalculated, because chaos is not merely inconvenient for Beijing. It is dangerous. If you believe global power shifts through treaties and long-term plans, this moment should unsettle you. Because to understand what comes next, we must first understand what China thought it had built and why that foundation may already be cracking. What exactly is the problem China now faces? Strip away the drama of the raid, and you see something more fundamental. Beijing believed it was operating in a world governed by patterns, predictable incentives, gradual shifts, a system where influence is earned slowly through investment, diplomacy, and patience. That is how China built its position in Venezuela, not with troops or ultimatums, but with contracts, loans, and infrastructure. Oil for cash, stability for access. It was a model Beijing has repeated across the global south for decades. Trump's move shattered that assumption, because the real shock was not the arrest itself, it was the message behind it. That power, in this moment, may no longer wait for consensus. It may not respect timelines, and it may not care how much patience has already been invested. For China, this creates a dilemma with no clean answers. Respond too forcefully and risk escalation. Do nothing and signal vulnerability. Adapt too slowly and fall behind a world moving faster and rougher than expected. To see why this strategy once made perfect sense, we need to step back into the history that shaped how China learned to play the long game. China's approach to Venezuela did not emerge overnight. It was forged by history and by trauma. For much of the late 20th century, China watched what chaos did to states that moved too fast. The Soviet collapse, financial crises in Asia, regime changes backed by sudden force. Beijing drew a simple lesson. Volatility destroys power faster than weakness ever does. So China chose a different path. It would trade speed for endurance, ideology for pragmatism, and military projection for economic gravity. Venezuela fit that logic perfectly. At the turn of the century, China needed energy to fuel its rise. Venezuela needed cash to survive isolation. Beijing offered loans, infrastructure, railways, power plants. Caracas offered oil steady, long-term, predictable, no lectures, no interference, just mutual dependence. Over time, this became a template. China embedded itself quietly, assuming that deep economic roots would be harder to uproot than any government. But that model relies on one fragile condition: a stable international order where rules slow down power. And when those rules weaken, the long game suddenly looks exposed. That is the vulnerability Trump's move revealed, and it sets the stage for the first real crisis China now faces. The first shock came faster than Beijing expected. In one night, the relationship China had treated as durable was reduced to a liability. Not gradually, not through negotiations, but through force broadcast to the world in a single photograph. For Beijing, this was the nightmare scenario. Not because Maduro was irreplaceable, but because the rules were ignored. A sovereign leader seized. No multilateral process, no slow escalation, just action. That image traveled far beyond Caracas. It landed in boardrooms in Beijing, in ministries across Latin America, in capitals that had welcomed Chinese money, believing it came without geopolitical risk. Suddenly, that assumption looked fragile. Chinese firms began asking quiet questions. What happens to contracts when governments fall overnight? What happens to assets when chaos becomes policy? What happens when patience meets unpredictability? China condemned the raid, using the language it knows best: sovereignty, international law, restraint. But words could not undo the damage, because the crisis was not moral, it was structural. If the United States was willing to move this way in Venezuela, then every long-term calculation China had made in the region now carried a new variable, one it could not control, and that forced Beijing to confront a deeper problem hidden beneath the headlines. What sits beneath this crisis is not oil or ideology or even Venezuela itself. It is a clash between two ways of exercising power. China's system is built on accumulation. Capital first, influence later, control eventually. It assumes that depth beats speed, and that once interests are intertwined, disruption becomes too costly for anyone to attempt. Trump's system works differently. It favors leverage over patience, shock over signaling, and ambiguity over reassurance. The objective is not to manage the system, but to dominate the moment. That is why this raid mattered so much to Beijing. It exposed a structural weakness in China's model. Economic gravity only works if the environment remains stable long enough for gravity to pull. But chaos breaks gravity. Contracts lose meaning when governments disappear overnight. Infrastructure becomes stranded when politics turn volatile. Influence evaporates when investors fear that proximity itself invites retaliation. This is why Beijing now faces a paradox. The deeper it embeds itself in contested regions, the more visible and vulnerable it becomes. The very strategy designed to avoid confrontation may now be attracting it. And unlike tariffs or trade disputes, this is not a problem China can negotiate its way out of. It cannot slow down an opponent who thrives on speed. It cannot hedge against unpredictability without abandoning the principles that built its rise. Which is why the tension did not end with Venezuela. It escalated toward a second, far more dangerous flashpoint. The second crisis unfolded not in Caracas, but in Beijing's imagination. Because once the shock settled, Chinese officials began asking a far more unsettling question. If Washington was willing to act this way in Venezuela, how far else might it go? The answer came quickly and bluntly. This is the Western Hemisphere. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared, "We're not going to allow it to be a base of operations for adversaries and rivals." The message was unmistakable. This was not about one country. It was about boundaries, about who decides where influence is allowed and where it is not. For China, this turned Venezuela from a regional problem into a global signal. If the United States was drawing red lines so openly, then China's entire overseas footprint had to be reevaluated. Latin America, ports, energy, infrastructure, even trade, and inevitably, the conversation drifted to Taiwan. Not because Beijing saw a direct parallel, but because nationalists began asking it anyway. If force can rewrite reality in Caracas, what stops it elsewhere? China's leadership rejected that logic. Taiwan, in Beijing's view, is internal, not precedent-based, not negotiable through foreign examples. But the danger was never imitation. It was miscalculation. Because moments like this compress decision-making. They shrink reaction time. And they increase the risk that one unexpected move triggers another faster than anyone intended. That is how great powers stumble into conflict. And while China may hate chaos, it now finds itself operating inside a system that is generating more of it than ever before. For ordinary people, none of this feels abstract. If you are a factory worker in Guangdong, a logistics manager in Shenzhen, or a small exporter trying to plan 6 months ahead, chaos is not a theory. It is anxiety. It is hesitation. It is the quiet fear that rules you relied on yesterday may vanish tomorrow. This is what moments like Venezuela do to people far from Caracas. When global power becomes unpredictable, jobs feel less secure, investments pause, supply chains tighten. Growth slows not because of one raid, but because confidence breaks. And if you live in a country that has welcomed Chinese money, you feel it too. You begin to wonder, does this partnership protect us or expose us? Does alignment bring stability or unwanted attention? This is the human cost of great power confrontation. Not explosions, but uncertainty. Not headlines, but delayed decisions that ripple through families, businesses, and futures. You don't get a vote in these choices, yet you pay the price when leaders gamble. And that is why this story matters to you. Because when powerful countries stop playing by shared rules, it is ordinary people who absorb the shock first and longest. But the consequences do not stop at borders. They spread outward, reshaping the global balance in ways that few countries can escape. The impact does not stay local, it radiates outward. Venezuela sits at the intersection of energy, geopolitics, and great power signaling. When stability there collapses, the tremors reach far beyond Latin America. Oil markets react. Investment flows hesitate. Governments reassess who they can safely partner with and at what cost. For China, this is especially dangerous. Its global strategy depends on trust. Not trust in ideology, but trust in consistency. The belief that Chinese investment brings roads, ports, power, and not confrontation. Trump's move injects doubt into that equation. Now, countries across the global south must ask a harder question. If hosting Chinese infrastructure risks attracting American pressure, is the trade-off still worth it? If neutrality is no longer respected, can smaller states really stay out of great power rivalry? This is how influence erodes without a single shot fired, not through defeat, but through hesitation. Projects delayed, deals reconsidered, doors quietly closed. At the same time, Washington is making its own intentions clearer, pushing back against Chinese ports, energy assets, and logistics hubs, even in regions once considered peripheral. The world is fragmenting into zones of pressure. And in that environment, China's patient, interconnected model faces a test it was never designed for. Which brings us to the question that now defines this entire episode. What happens next? Three futures now sit in front of Beijing and none are comfortable. The first is adaptation. China absorbs the shock, tightens risk controls, and continues its global push more cautiously. Fewer bold investments, more hedging, more emphasis on diplomacy over expansion. Stability preserved, but influence grows slower and opportunities slip away. The second is pushback. China decides that restraint invites pressure. It doubles down in contested regions, signaling that it will not retreat from places like Latin America, no matter the cost. That may deter rivals, but it also raises the risk of confrontation with the United States in spaces where rules are already eroding. The third is fragmentation, the most dangerous path. A world where countries are forced to choose sides, where infrastructure, trade, and energy are divided into competing blocks, where every investment is political and every partnership carries strategic risk. In that world, China's long game no longer works because the board itself is breaking apart. Beijing's instinct is to avoid all three extremes, to buy time, to reduce volatility, to keep the system intact just long enough for its accumulated power to matter. But time is no longer fully under its control because the rules that once slowed history are weakening. And when speed replaces stability, even the most patient strategy begins to fray. That is the moment China now faces. And it brings us to the final question, one that matters not just to Beijing, but to everyone watching this unfold. This story ends where all power stories eventually do, with a choice. The United States chose speed, shock, unpredictability. China chose patience, accumulation, stability. For years, the second approach seemed safer, smarter, inevitable. But Venezuela revealed a hard truth. Power does not only belong to those who plan longest, it also belongs to those willing to disrupt the plan itself. Beijing now understands that the world it prepared for may no longer exist. A world of gradual shifts, of rules that slow down force, of time as an ally. That world is thinning, replaced by one where momentum matters, and hesitation carries a cost. China will not abandon the long game. It cannot. Too much of its rise depends on it. But it will be forced to play that game in an environment it does not control and increasingly distrusts. For the rest of us, the lesson is simpler and more unsettling. When great powers stop agreeing on the rules, uncertainty becomes the norm. And in uncertain systems, even rational actors make dangerous moves. If you want to understand where global order is heading, why stability feels weaker, shocks more frequent, and futures harder to predict, this is the pattern to watch. And this story is not over. It has only just begun.